I know that I'm going to have to give this disclaimer repeatedly throughout this video, but Hades 2 is a very good game. It expands upon the gameplay and narrative scope of its beloved predecessor. It has tight gameplay, fabulous art and music, and oozes style out of every menu and every boss encounter. So why is it that I felt sort of hollowed out after the credits? Hades 2 has a rich post-credit experience to offer, but unlike the first Hades game, I felt very little pull to actually engage with it. I felt done. Now, that might not sound like much of a problem, but a roguelite game like this is built from the ground up on replayability, and the original Hades was almost impossible to put down. So what's different? I know I'm not alone in this experience with Hades 2, and I finally have a punchline I've reached about the game, a theory about what the designers became blind to as they developed an excellent game that's nonetheless holding itself back from its potential. So let's talk about Hades 2 and the fine art of hand-waving. This is Ludologica. So let's start with some spoiler warnings. I'm going to talk about Hades 2, including its late game design, most of its bosses, and much of its story. However, I'm not going to actually discuss major plot reveals or the actual story ending of the game, at least what I consider major plot reveals. I know a lot of people have strong opinions about the actual story of the game, but that's not what I'm focused on in this video. The point I want to make runs a little deeper than that, so I'm not going to spoil plot details when I don't have to. I will also be discussing the first Hades game, including the late and post game, but once again, try not to give away the specific story ending. Now, it may feel that I'm getting overly critical of Hades 2, but there is a point I am building toward, so if you follow along, I promise we'll get somewhere. I'll also acknowledge several times that Hades 2 is a very good game, but I think we should be willing to hold even great games to high standards if we want this medium to keep growing and reach greater heights. With all of that said, I'm going to start with the observations I only started making when I started my second playthrough. Part 1. Why this boss? After giving the game a break for a few months, I restarted it from scratch, and quickly fell back into the groove, until I reached the first boss. Hades 2 begins its litany of boss fights with your mentor, Hecate. Melinoe expresses her surprise at being slowed down by her own teacher, but the fight is framed as a final test before facing greater foes. This isn't that unusual a trope, so it's easy enough to accept. Until I remembered that Hecate doesn't just test you one time. She will continue to stand in your way every attempt you make for the remainder of the game. Training is one thing, but she explicitly admits at the end of the fight that any injuries she caused will continue to weigh you down. And after the initial run is complete, she will admit this again back at the crossroads, that you could have gone further if she hadn't stood in your way. Ultimately, this isn't a major problem. You get very accustomed to defeating Hecate, and by the late game she becomes little more than a warm-up for your run. On its own, this is a narrative handwave that we could accept and move on from. But it's not the only time this happens. Once you back up and start thinking about it, many of the bosses in the game have no good reason for confronting you. The second boss is Scylla, who mostly just happens to be in your way, but who is also convinced that you are intentionally seeking her out. This is a misunderstanding that could be cleared up by a single conversation, but it is admittedly a very amusing misunderstanding, so it can stay. Next, we encounter Cerberus in the Morning Fields, which is a very dramatic reveal when you first encounter him. You need to fight the sadness off of him to return him to his senses. But after you succeed, you know he's just going to wander into the fields to get overrun by sadness yet again. So that's 3 bosses in a row that aren't actually aligned with the antagonist, and just happen to be in your way each time you do a run. There is a larger explanation for this, which is that you're taking a roundabout route into Tartarus to take Kronos by surprise. But then, after your first time breaking in, the element of surprise is gone. Again, the game explicitly acknowledges this, and several NPCs ask you questions about these incongruities, like, hey, why do you keep fighting Hecate? Or, why doesn't Cerberus recognize you now and let you pass? It's a classic writing trick of pointing out an inconsistency to make it feel like there's an answer when there isn't one. If it feels like I'm nitpicking, it's because I am. Each of these individual cases is fine, and none of this really bothered me on a first playthrough. There is, however, a pattern that's emerging, which is that the developers of Hades 2 believe that hand-waving narrative motivations comes with no cost. In fact, these disconnects are played up for entertainment or surprise factor, and it's clear that the developers are getting very comfortable with relying on this kind of hand-waving to build out their story. Which brings us to the most questionable boss of all, found not in the underworld, but on the surface, Prometheus. He has the gift of foresight, supposedly, and knows exactly what will happen. If we take that premise seriously, then he must know that you will eventually overcome him, and Kronos, and beat the game. He knows that he is on the losing side, and he eventually hints at this directly. So why is he fighting you exactly? It's simply not clear. It's apparently an unavoidable part of the future he has foreseen. And there is some story development here I'm not going to get into, but at the end of the day, the real answer is pretty clearly just because he's a cool boss for this region, and any other reason he gives is a vague justification. Once again, on his own, Prometheus is forgivable, and even an interesting character. The point I'm getting at is that hand-waving details of the narrative quickly becomes a habit in the writing, and then a crutch that the writers can't help leaning on more and more as the game progresses. And this tendency eventually does lead to a breaking point that I will get to. But beyond the narrative, this same mindset of embracing the arbitrary gradually leaks into the game design as well. In order to see what I mean, we need to back up and talk about the first Hades game. Part 2. Dying Elegantly. Upon its initial release, Hades almost immediately became genre-defining for the admittedly niche genre of a roguelite hack-and-slash dungeon crawler. Like Hades 2, it has tight gameplay, excellent visual design, and a killer soundtrack. But when I think of one word to define the design of Hades, it's elegance. What I mean by that is that all of the gameplay and story of Hades is tied together into a smooth gameplay loop. When you start the game, you barely get any introduction. Zagreus just drops onto the screen and you start playing, trying to get as far as you can, with the only stated objective being escape the underworld. After you inevitably fail, you return to the House of Hades and have a handful of short conversations, providing a little context for what is happening. And then you gather yourself and start another run. You make a little progress, get a little story, and jump right back in. The amount of time you spend back at the House of Hades is just enough downtime between runs to feel like a natural breather, to unwind, collect yourself, and get one nugget of story at a time. The strength of this design is that you never doubt what you're supposed to do next. All progress, both narrative and mechanical, is tied to runs. And secondary objectives are usually designed to encourage you to vary up the weapons you use and the boons you're collecting, to try out a wide variety of builds. That variety keeps the repetition from feeling stale, while helping you feel like there's always incremental progress to make in each run, even if you aren't able to beat a particular boss yet. In fact, there are subtle ways that the game increases the smoothness of its progression that you may not even notice. The first time you beat a boss, you get a unique reward. Titan's blood from the first boss, diamonds from the second, etc. But if you beat that boss again, at the same difficulty level with the same weapon, you get darkness instead, the universal currency for strengthening your character. What that means is that a player who is struggling to overcome a particular boss will gain more darkness and level up faster to smooth out the difficulty curve, whereas a player that is advancing quickly will be given the opportunity to increase the difficulty and gain long-term resources and variety instead of immediate power. This is an organic way for the game to build in difficulty scaling for different players without ever drawing attention to itself. Like I said, elegant. Narratively, the story is similarly tight and effective. As a player, you begin knowing only that you are trying to escape from Hades, and don't even know Zagreus' motivation for escaping. All of the enemies you encounter have an obvious reason for confronting you. They are under orders from Hades to stop you from escaping. Except the satyrs, which you choose to fight in order to avoid having to fight your own dog. Because, dogs. Because of this setup, there's nothing that needs to be explained about most of the challenges you encounter, and the story progresses by feeding you one detail at a time. If you're not super familiar with Greek mythology, it has some surprises built in that keep things interesting. And if you are familiar with Greek mythology, then it's satisfying to see how well the story fits traditional mythology with its much more modern storytelling style. Hades does have a very self-aware, cheeky vibe to its story, with a protagonist that talks back to the narrator and makes way too many jokes about daytime idioms not really applying to the eternal night of the underworld. However, this snarky meta-awareness perfectly fits Zagreus as a character, a relative youth with a more modern outlook, frustrated by the status quo of his immortal and stubborn family. Without giving away too much of the story, the biggest narrative handwave of the game comes after the credits, when the game justifies your continued attempts to break out of the underworld by giving Zagreus the title of Security Specialist. By the time we get here, we're happy to accept the justification and jump back in, because the game has given us a smooth gradient of both mechanical and narrative rewards throughout the entire game, and they both continue past the credits. This elegant loop keeps many players hooked into the double digits of heat, the game's optional difficulty level, and kept the game relevant for years. Of course, Hades has its flaws, but the smooth integration of the entire experience into its main loop makes it a masterclass in elegant design. And with all of that in mind, let's look at the ways that Hades 2 expands upon its predecessor. Part 3. Picking every direction. So how does Hades 2 build upon this design? It starts in a very similar place, but then starts expanding in all directions. There's an Omega attack system, which in effect doubles the number of attack options you have in combat. There are more things to unlock, and a greater variety of resources to collect and unlock those things with. Optional difficulty is even more nuanced with the Vow of Night, which not only makes the run harder, but tasks you with facing a specific boss to claim your bounty. But the most significant change is the addition of a whole second run. After making a certain amount of progress, you unlock runs on the surface, in addition to underworld runs, and you'll find different resources in each direction. All of this additional complexity can be a little overwhelming, but the game does a pretty good job of introducing new elements incrementally. For a new player, there are just enough little things to unlock to get that small sense of progress from each run, and for veteran players, there's a slowdown mechanic, in the form of Eris appearing and cursing you if you make too much progress too quickly. This curse increases the damage taken from all sources, and continues to get worse as you progress, rendering it almost impossible to complete a run on a fresh save file. She compensates you with some immediate resources, which works, but is certainly not elegant. Fortunately, the game reassures you that Eris is fickle by nature, and will grow bored of interfering after a few days, which turns out to be true until later, when she becomes a boss encounter on the surface that will consistently interfere for the remainder of the game. Nonetheless, I actually do like many of the additions of Hades 2. The game very much has a yes and attitude about its design, fleshing out elements and adding polish and even flourish where it has the opportunity to be most satisfying. My favorite example of unnecessary flourish is Scylla, who not only has a band diegetically playing their boss fight music, but each of the instruments separately drops out as you defeat members of the band, and you can hear the vocals get muffled when Scylla hides in her shell. Not only that, but they introduce new songs as the game progresses, which are clearly being written about Millenoi. I Am Going to Claw Out Your Eyes and Drown You to Death is not only a hilarious name for a song, but the song itself is a certified banger. And around the time that it starts to get stuck in your own head, you can hear Millenoi also catch herself getting the lyrics stuck in her head. I love this. So anyway, by the midpoint of the game, I had settled into a nice flow. I would pick whatever weapon was incentivized for that run, activate the Vow of Night, and go whichever direction led to a bounty. This made for maximal variety, and I knew I would make some kind of progress whether I went up or down. Sometimes I would be a little annoyed that the Vow of Night was pointing in a direction that was incompatible with some secondary quest objective, or get annoyed with dialogue telling me that I should make sure to go in a particular direction. But this was minor compared to the richness of the mid-game experience. And then something happened. I had made enough progress on my underworld runs that the game expressly told me to stop doing runs in this direction. Without giving away any of the story specifics, the end of run story sequence became suddenly and jarringly different, and the game made it clear that I needed to exclusively focus on runs in the other direction. I can't overstate how strange this is. The feeling of flow and incremental progress is central to the player's drive in a roguelite game. By telling me, as a player, to stop doing runs and focus on clearing specific objectives in order to reach the end credits, the game had changed its relationship to me. Before this point, quests and story objectives were motivation for me to stay in the flow of the game. After this point, my focus was on completing specific tasks to reach the credits. But I was invested, and the runs were still fun, so I pushed through and found myself finally reaching the breaking point, where hand-waving contrivance was too much for me. Welcome to the post-game. Part 4. Let them eat temporal anomalies. Once again, I'm going to avoid specific plot reveals as much as possible, but I am going to explain, in broad terms, the conceit of post-credit runs. And maybe I should do a separate video where I actually discuss the plot and what they could have done differently, but for now I have a more specific point to make. Broadly speaking, the ending of Hades 2 is conclusive enough that there isn't an obvious narrative reason for Millenoi to keep doing runs. However, this game's story revolves around Kronos, the Titan of Time. So I figured early on that there would be some sort of temporal anomaly shenanigans involved in the post-game. I was right, but holy dearth of muses did they choose the most awkward possible way to include timeline shifting. The official explanation of why you continue doing runs is to cut off alternate possible timelines from somehow collapsing into this one. In order to do this, you have to follow the path you were on during the war with Kronos, so as to align the possible worlds, so that at the very end, you can jump into an alternate universe and fight Kronos, or the last boss of Service runs, in this alternate world. Which means that many of the enemies you encounter are in on this idea and continue to pretend to be involved in a cataclysmic war for an indefinite period of time, so that you can fight through them to erase alternate timelines that probably don't matter. Various characters will explicitly say that this is probably unnecessary, And yet all of the Olympian and chthonic gods are fine with indefinitely keeping the world in a state of near-apocalyptic chaos, so that you can do unnecessary extra runs, just in case. This is a bafflingly bad explanation for post-credit runs. It's up to you how much narrative motivation you need to engage in post-credit content, and the developers of Hades 2 clearly assumed that players who made it to the end of the game would be hooked by a fun gameplay loop, and wouldn't particularly care how hand-wavy the explanation for the post-game was. I myself am often inclined to engage with fun mechanics for their own sake, but I still found this to be a bridge too far. Part of the issue for me is that the game has already been relying on narrative handwaves and relatively arbitrary requirements for task completion already. Remember all the earlier points about arbitrary boss motivations? They all hit me with newfound ferocity in the post-game. Why is Cerberus continuing to leave the house and get overrun with sadness in the morning fields now? Is Hades intentionally throwing him out every day just to make his dog sad enough to fight us? And what about Ephyra? Is everyone really okay with the city just being endlessly on fire and overrun by the corpses of the living dead, just to make a good atmospheric backdrop to Melinoe's hobby of destroying alternate universes? I know that gods being fickle and cruel to mortals is pretty on brand for Greek mythology, but this feels extreme even by those standards. And all of this is made worse by the disruption of the gameplay flow that happened leading to the finale. When the game told me to stop doing underworld runs, it changed the underlying rules. It told me that reaching a satisfying narrative conclusion was more important than maintaining gameplay flow. And yet this same game is refusing to take responsibility to provide a satisfying narrative, and is expecting me to switch right back into the gameplay-focused flow that it disrupted. I also suddenly realized, on the mechanical front, that this disruption had limited my interest in progressing the Vow of Night. Since the mechanic only rewards you for going to the surface half the time, I found myself near the end only turning the mechanic on half the time, while grinding through surface runs to reach the credits. Hades 2 had drawn my attention to the arbitrariness of these goals and gameplay elements, and it was very hard to motivate myself to care about them again. The thing is, absolutely none of these problems were necessary to make the game Supergiant wanted to make. Having a second run is a good idea, and a natural way to expand the scope and variety of gameplay after the first Hades, but it needed to feel like natural run variety, not like an obligation. Character motivations can be fudged to fit the narrative, but if you find yourself pointing out discrepancies in your own story more than once, then you should address the discrepancy instead of continuing to shrug it off. And if you're going to introduce timeline shenanigans, then you better pay it off. The post-game of Hades 2 could have been riveting. Imagine if resolving the main storyline caused real fragmentation in the nature of time. One happy ending destabilizes everything else, and Melinoe needs to find a way to repair time after the war. Or imagine if she could dive back into past runs to confront her own failures. What if space-time got so twisted that it opened up runs where enemies and allies are in the wrong places and times? Essentially an official randomizer mode. I'm spitballing here, but the point is that I can think of dozens of options that would have been more interesting than what we got. Now, all of that said, while making this video, I've been replaying Hades 2 after the most recent patch, and the truth is, I'm having a blast. The reason I care enough to make a video about my frustrations is that Hades 2 is so strong on so many levels that I want to see it reach its potential. I want games like this to figure out how to keep pushing the envelope and make an ever richer gaming landscape. So I hope it's clear that even when I call a decision baffling, I'm saying it with love in my heart. I decided early on to avoid discussing the specific story ending of Hades 2 in this video, but along the way I found myself constantly thinking about it, and it was hard not to bring it up. So there's a possible separate video about the story that might be brewing. If you're interested in that, or in any of the other games I analyze on this channel, make sure to subscribe. And while you're at it, you can like, hype, comment, and do the other witchy rituals that will help the algorithm know that this is some engaging content. So mote it be.